Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's thank you for being here. Thank you for honoring our invitation. We are really delighted to myself and Sue to have you here on behalf of Talent Talks and Lita, who's here as well. Um, I could say a lot about Martin, but you should go and listen to the podcasts. Martin Aggie and I, Aggie's Martin's wife and partner in life and business, have known each other for years and years, probably about 17 or 18 years now. What's most amazing is, or let me put it this way, what I love in a person is when who they say they are and how they show up align. There's just something about the quality of a person who aligns with how they say they show up. And that's who Martin and Aggie are to me. And more so when you think about the kind of work that they do. So Martin works with the Presencing Institute, and if you know the Presencing work, that's Otto Scharmer's work that initially came out of MIT. Martin holds and hosts that work in the UK and to a large extent in Africa with the U Lab, the Ubuntu.lab. What I love about the conversation we're going to have this morning, and I was speaking to Karen about it earlier, is we who live with the hope that the world can be better than it is now, and we who do what we do because we see that conversations can be had, and conversations need to be had that will shift us from where we are to where we want to be. This is why we do this work. We do this work because we have a hope that something that will be created will be stronger and better, or maybe just even a little different to what it is now. And it's that hope that keeps us doing what we do. And this is what this work is about. I remember when Sue and I first of all thought about this idea of a consistent employee experience. So we were sitting with one of the clients that we have, and they were talking about how for some reason they're unable to show up in a way that they have businesses in South Africa and they have businesses in other countries. Even though they get customer experience, and there's a real strong and clear focus about how we need to win the customer and we need to create an experience for the customer, and everything is driven towards holding that customer, they're not able to do the same and have the same kind of conversation about employees. And if you think about the fact that employees are the ones driving this customer experience, it sounds a bit ironic, isn't it? And so this was where the conversation started, is how do we hold the employee and the employee experience as important and almost, if I could say, as sacred as we hold the customer experience? And how do we put technology behind it like we do with customers? How do we put information and analytics behind it? But most importantly, how do we put conscious thought behind it? How do we put the kind of thought that says, where are we and where do we need to go? Because if we don't take the time to create the spaces for conscious thought through dialogue, what's going to happen is that the future of work will come. And we will find that we're not, especially in Africa, as equipped as we could have been if we had taken the time to have these conversations. And this is why we've invited you here this morning, is what can we co-create together? What can we start thinking through together as we imagine how Africa shows up in the future of work? One of my favorite hashtag the Africa We Want quotes is the idea that if we were able to leapfrog the inefficiencies and the lack in the technology, the telephone connectedness space. So if I think about Nigeria, my country, we went from tapping those, I don't know if you remember those rotary dial phones, and then we had these big brick phones, and then a few elite people had cell phones, and it cost hundreds of thousands to run a contract. And suddenly, Econet came in, and it democratized telecommunications, and everybody had 1, 2, 3 phones, and people could link with people in the village. People in the village had phones, and this is what technology leaping can do when you just think about what can be different. And I have the same hope for how we hold work in Africa and how we are organizing ourselves for the future of work in Africa. We can either sleep and let it run away and sort of wake up one day and say, what happened? Which is what we're doing in most of our HR spaces, no offense. We're still tracking and chasing things that really don't matter anymore. They really don't in the grand scale of things. And we need to leapfrog that conversation. We need to create spaces for conversations. The word disrupt is overused, but truly, we need to disrupt the way that we're thinking about it. But disrupt in a conscious way and disrupt in a purposeful way. And this is why I love the theory and I love the frame that it provides, is how do you open your heart, open your mind, open your will to what's working and what's not working, so that we can let go of the things that are not working, and we can hopefully start looking for the things that could work and be brave about experimenting with them. So this is what this convening this morning is about. Once again, thank you for coming, and I know that it will be valuable for you, and I look forward to the quality of your own contributions, because we're going to create this together in dialogue. So Martin, thank you. Welcome.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Egbe, Sue, for inviting Aggie and myself to be here this morning. I'd like to share a few thoughts with you, and at any one point then we can have some dialogue. My starting point is simply this. I have particular assumptions on what creates employee experience. Like in any iceberg, there is the manifest, what we see, the brand, the infrastructure of the institutions and organizations we work with. We know that if we want to truly deliver consistent, generative employee experience, we need to work slightly deeper than the 10% we see on the surface. That our focus must be around issues of structure. How are we structured? Structures are not an act of God. Structures are things, processes, matrices we create in order to help us to deliver our work. When we are paying female employees same qualifications, same experience, same level, less than the men, that doesn't come from nature. Humans sat and decided that's the way it goes. When my father decided to focus more on us, the boys, to attend school and let the two girls only go as far as secondary school, he had a structure in mind. In his mind, he was preparing for his own future. The boys were going to look after him, except that all of us have left now. It's only the one girl that never went to school that lives near him. So structures are things we create. We can choose. We have seen a lot of shifts in the structures we set, even in the way we sit with one another in places of work. But structures don't come by themselves. Structures come from what is between our ears, our patterns of thinking. How we think about things will create the structures which will produce the results we want or don't want above the waterline. So if you really want people to experience who we are as an organization, who we are as a country and as a community, the real work is below the waterline. Our thinking will shape the structures. The structures will give us the results we want or don't want. When we are measuring the wealth of our organizations, the wealth of countries, again, it's the thinking that goes into that. Globally, we have been duped for a long period of time into thinking the best way to measure our wealth as nations is by GDP. Fortunately, now we are asking questions around, is that the best way we can measure how well we are doing? If there was an oil spillage, God forbid, in Angola, and the international community felt we get a lot of rich oil from Angola, they mobilized resources, mopped up the spill. In that year, you can guarantee the GDP of Angola will bump up. Because it counts such variables. And that's why we are not surprised, or we should be surprised, that the small country of Bhutan is teaching us on how to think differently about how we measure wealth. That's why they have abandoned GDP as a measure of progress. That's why they are using GNH, gross national happiness. What if we humans counted happiness as a standard of whether we are making progress or not? Thoughts don't come by themselves. Thoughts come from the fundamental beliefs and values we hold. And organizations need to inquire into that. What are our fundamental beliefs? What are the core values that drive who we are and what we do? It is those fundamental beliefs and values that will give rise to the thoughts that will give rise to the structures, and then we stand a better chance of influencing what happens above the waterline. So branding and everything else, important as they are simply a manifestation of that which is at below the waterline. And for me, the work of leadership, the work of shifting organizations must be around these three here. I have the opportunity of working with a group of emerging financial institutions called the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. So the Presencing Institute, EGBE, and MIT were invited to support the new level of leaders. The new level of leaders in these institutions. Institutions such as Triodos Bank, GLS, Van City, which are rethinking the role of money in society. And that rethinking is based on the fact that money is a tool that you use in order to activate human talent and human capacity. Then the financial products they produce are completely different or somewhat different from what we see in traditional financial institutions. So let me just try and take you through the last 400 years of economic evolution, at least from our perspective as the Presencing Institute. And then I will situate our conversation for today in that. If we think of the extreme left as an operating system that we humans, even before technology adopted the word, we have always functioned with an operating system. When something doesn't work, we switch into a different operating system. I would like to talk about how we have coordinated ourselves, our relationship with nature, our relationship with labor, capital, technology, leadership, and our consumption patterns. So, in operating system 0.0, traditional society, what do we see? Coordination mechanism is simply the community itself. In terms of how we related to nature, we called Mother Nature because we knew we harvested all our food, our well-being, our water from nature directly. Labor, every community organized and met its own needs. Capital was simply community wisdom. Technology also community wisdom. Leadership was by everybody. We were consuming in order to survive. Then population begins to grow and we shift the operating system. So around the 17th and 18th centuries, what do we see? We invent the state in the formal way that it is now. Sometimes I think about the state as if it has existed as long as humans. This is a later invention. So we invent the state. And what is our way of coordinating? Is by hierarchy and regulation. We start relating to nature as a resource. And labor was supplied by villains and slaves. Capital became feudal power. We see, in terms of technology, the humblest of tools coming into play, allowing us to increase our production. Leadership was ruled by the stick, authoritarian. You do as I have instructed you or else. In terms of consumption, still needs driven. We have a lot of needs and we need to meet them. However, as we saw that the state was not good enough to meet our needs, growing and complex, we invented operating system 2.0. We operated the free market. This was around the 18th and 19th centuries, and the coordination mechanism then became markets and competition. We begin to see nature not only as Mother Nature and a resource, it's a commodity. You can sell it, you can harvest it. Labor also became a commodity. Capital is only valuable where it is deployed. It is extremely externally blind. And we start seeing a shift from humble tools into complex machines, again helping us to truly become more productive. Leadership shifts from simply being authoritarian. You also need a carrot. And at that point, consumerism sets in because we are slightly more able to produce than we immediately need. However, when we saw that Adam Smith's invisible hand doesn't sort out every problem, we moved to operating system 3.0. Social markets, particularly starting to emerge in the OECD countries around the 19th and 20th centuries. So social market sets in. That we begin to recognize the reality of market failure. So the coordination mechanism around that time becomes networks and negotiation. Organizing special interest groups emerge. That's when we see the labor unions coming into play with full force. Nature, we realize, it must be a regulated commodity, just like labor. Finance must also be regulated. But in terms of technology, we start seeing system-centric automation, that humans can work alongside and sometimes even replaced by automated systems. In terms of leadership, people are not simply asking that they be given a carrot, they want to participate. Can I be consulted? And we begin to see the rise of conscious consumption. People start asking, where are these bananas from? If they can trace them to slavery, then they don't want them. Where is this cotton from? I think we can easily recognize those operating systems, and I suspect we are on the cusp of operating system 4.0. And in some cases, you find that operating. And I call that Ubuntu-centric deep innovation. My colleagues at MIT call it simply deep innovation. I added Ubuntu-centric centricity because as we talked about what the manifestations of these were, then I said, in Africa we have a word that describes what we are talking about. So we see a situation where seeing and acting from the whole, organizing Common interest is a big issue. That should be the future coordination mechanism, the capacity to see and act from the whole. That when we are a business, we don't just exist because of the bottom line. And when we are a business, we don't do business outside the context of nature. We are anchored on nature. But sometimes we run businesses as if nature is a by-the-way side. Everything we do is so deeply connected with nature or based on nature. So, nature, we see that it is a cultivated common. We need to help nature so that nature can look after us. We are talking about the Bahamas being hit in the last few days. Labor is entrepreneurship. Labor has moved from simply being a commodity that you can afford, dispense of. It is entrepreneurship. We are seeing the rise of this. In some cases, particularly with the young people. Living in England, I was watching BBC. They were talking about a young boy of 11 who had created an app using his parents' laptop. And Google heard about it, bought the app at 42 million. 42 million pounds. It is the kind of money that even if you gave me 3,000 years to live as an individual, I'm not likely to create. 42 million is the kind of money that most of the organizations we work for are aspiring for as their next level of performance. But this young little boy cracked an app which Google bought at that price. That might be an exaggeration, but you know also that in your own organizations you have these young people, and sometimes people of my age, who are so gifted at what they do that actually you can't treat them as ordinary employees. You have to relate with them differently. And they ask for different things because they know what they bring. So, we are seeing in operating system 4.0 that capital will not just be externally cited, but also we need dedicated capital that is externally aware, that is targeted at solving certain societal challenges. That's why the banks I talked about, if you go there and try to borrow money in order to buy a house, they would say, this is fantastic. Then they will send their staff to where you are trying to buy your house, and you say, it's this place. They make assessment, then they realize you are facing in a direction where you can harvest 90% of sunlight. And they invite you, if you are not willing to replace your roof with solar so that you delink or reduce dependency on the national grid, then we are not going to go ahead and lend you the money. If you want to be a farmer, and they come there and they look at what you're doing and they say, this, show us your plans. If they see that your use of fertilizers, artificial fertilizers, is going to destroy the soil, then they say, no, we are not the kind of bank that you can borrow from. So capital can become dedicated. In terms of leadership, participation doesn't become enough. The kind of talent I'm talking about, they don't simply want to participate. They want to be co-creators. Even if you are the one who began the industry, they bring their talent, then you say, can we start from creating the future we want together? Co-creation is different from participation. We are going to see more and more conscious consumption. Technology will help us. As I'm buying a product and I put myself on there, I should be able to get enough data to make me decide whether I should go for this brand or that brand, because all the information I need to make a decision will be there. I suspect that organizations, communities that are going to consciously shift to operating system 4.0 will probably have a longer lifespan and more relevance to the needs of our society than otherwise. So in a way, I just wanted to put that across. Before I continue, can we just turn to our neighbors at the table and talk about where do we think our organizations are mostly operating from? Which is the operating system that is dominant in your organization currently, or if you're not coming from an organization in your community? Which is the operating system mostly at work? Please turn to your neighbors, and if the tables are too big, we just split so that we are small enough to chat.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm William from AdCorp. I think everybody can see me. Yes, I think one of the challenges, and as we looked and debated through these operating systems, one of the big issues for us is we're stuck in an environment where you see a few of these operating systems all playing out at once. And it's heavily linked to the, let's call it the generation of people and the age and the groups, because my parents typically operated in operating system 1. And we all get that sense. And I think that's the challenge for any business. There's a lot of talk about generation X, Z, etc. But the big challenge is, how do you activate these things? And how do you migrate from 2 to 3 to 4? Is it perhaps better to jump from 2 and create something new that operates in 4? So I think that's been the debate. We've got different views on that, but that's what we see in the industry, that there's a matrix of maturity levels in various businesses and even in our customers. But that's the thing from an innovation perspective. How do you then build the new while you're trying to keep the old alive to actually maintain your company?
Yeah.
And I think that's the challenge for us to address. But interesting from what you said earlier, when I look at these frameworks, my question always comes back to what perpetuates the thought and the thinking patterns in the iceberg, or the bottom of the iceberg. And then you look at our education systems that's in place, and I bet if we were to map something like this for our education system, I probably think we would be scared and to see what our kids and our next generations are being taught and how it aligns to this kind of thinking.
Wow. Wow.
Anyone else? What? Oh, there we go.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
Sorry for those that I have my back against, unfortunately. So let me start rather by addressing the elephant in the room, which is what's currently happening in the country. And as a South African, I'd like to say to my fellow Africans, we apologize. We are absolutely sorry, and we are appalled by what is happening. We are hoping that leadership would have a suitable response. It's already late. They were supposed to have a better one much sooner. So, and this is important to highlight because when you started, you said business cannot operate at while neglecting what is happening in the community, and case in point. With that said, let me share what we discussed. One of the things that we identified and we did not get to conclude is whether, so agreeing with the first speaker that there seems to be a interrelationship, then we questioned whether the industry informs where the thoughts are, right? For instance, if one is in the manufacturing industry, the education levels there tend to be much lower compared to the knowledge economy, be it your banking and the likes. And you find that those that are literate would tend to be more conscious about what they're consuming comes from, whereas the less literate would be more concerned about the price sensitivity. And that links to my last point, which we didn't get to discuss, which is digital literacy. So you gave the example that when one picks up a product, ideally, they can use their cell phone to trace where it comes from. That is on the assumption that you even know that your cell phone can do that, which unfortunately, it is not common knowledge. And what I have found personally is that there is this huge divide, what I call between the haves and the have-nots. The haves tend to take for granted the privilege of what they have access to. So that is the input from this table.
Thank you. So I just really want to acknowledge you for that comment because, or for those comments that you've made, because I think that they are unbelievably important at this point in time and today. And I think we should all be very conscious of the context that we're in today. And the fact that the Ubuntu conversation is occurring in a space which is very fraught and very emotional and that we are all super sensitized to. So the previous commentators' comments brought up two things for me. So in our conversation, well, you're in my conversation, Abongile. What really stood out for me, it was fascinating to utilize that matrix and think about our organization. And both of us felt that our organizations operate very much in the 4.0 space and are driving the 4.0 agenda. But what the truth is that because these are leadership development spaces, we're engaging consistently with every one of the other spaces. And it's painful. So as you were speaking, what was coming to me was this comment that we often talk about in our own organization of being on the bleeding edge, where you really believe in the 4.0 principles. That is what you work towards, but you are consistently engaging at every level. So we engage with education and state, and believe you me, that is 1. So I wish it was 0, because at least you could engage with that, but it is 1. And then we engage with business, which is the 2 and the 3. And it's really difficult because you're constantly driving an advocacy agenda about moving towards 4. And you meet some people that get that, but to really drive that conversation is painful. So encouragement to everybody in the room that's driving that conversation, and let's be sure that we support each other. It's a hard conversation to drive. And then, I'm sorry, what was your name again? Zwanki. So, okay, so she's also from this group of people. So, and I'm sorry to take a bit of time, but your comment about the digital literacy, I feel quite enraged. So we've got WEF coming up, and they're having this digital literacy conversation, and we had a huge think tank session with the people driving the presidential initiative on 4IR. And there is no consciousness that revolution is not about tech, it's about access. So this constant, the people who they think they're driving 4, but they're actually just entrenching 2 and 3. And yeah, just courage to all of us.
Thank you. Good morning, colleagues. Firstly, Nzwaki's words resonate. I'm a citizen of 20 countries in Africa. And over the last few days, I've been interacting and apologizing and explaining to our family who sits across the continent what's really happening, because I get asked what's happening on the ground. So we really apologize. Thank you for that. I think if I look at economic and societal evolution, our discussion was really about the organizations we represent. And, you know, I'm with Standard Bank, and we were just commenting around, if we look at the current operating system, it's on the cusp of free market and regulated market. And we discussed 2 or 3 examples around what's happening in the industry, not just with the bank. The first one was the disruptions that we're seeing, especially with technology. And I just want to acknowledge that when we see the iceberg, let's also understand that the iceberg is also interacting with the ocean. And the challenge on the technology alone really forced or created this rethink around how we're coordinating ourselves. And we have seen the likes of Investec, Time Bank, ABSA, coming together with us in saying, how do we address and organize ourselves when it comes to cloud, as we put our customers' information on the cloud, as we use the opportunities of this technology, how will it impact? And we solving for that as an industry, as one. The second example was, and I'm sure you have seen just before the interim result of the bank, a minority shareholder approaching us about how we're investing in coal-powered power stations. Are we continuing to do that? What's our conscience with regards to that? And that got a discussion at a very high level of the organization to really start thinking. So it's impacting on leadership. And the last point I want to make is around the recent retrenchments that you have seen, that we're closing branches, we're impacting 1,700 people. Reality is that within that, when one look at that, and I'm not sure where the media is getting the 6,000 figure from, but really, essentially, and in group IT alone, it was a small number. And personally, in my role, I have created entrepreneurs, over 100 of those that took voluntary, registered on entrepreneurship program, and today they're running their own organization. So from labor, that's changing a perspective and creating a new opportunity again. But these interactions, better managed, they will move us somewhere. But if not, and the key is with the leadership piece, if we get it right, everything falls in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those reflections, and particularly the last speaker indicating and situating even the iceberg itself within the wider context of the ocean. And that, for me, is the complete version of what we learned in the business school as systems thinking. It's when we don't just take the tips above the waterline and what is below, but also the wider context in which the entire life is played out. So this is, for me, just a way of thinking that helps us to intentionally decide where we want to be as a community, where we want to be as organizations. And true to your sharing, organizations can find themselves in many places. But once they become more conscious of what is possible, they can then mobilize their energies to be where they feel they would want to be. My own sense is that we seem to have an intuitive aspiration for operating system 4.0. And in real terms, I don't know now whether I can move the slides. The gentleman worked with something. Yeah, but I could try and just get there. So we are right, Egbe. We can. So for me, when I talk about 4.0, this is what it feels like. So Ubuntu, as a philosophy, it's a way of life. It's a way of how we work. We know this. I am because you are. My well-being is so intertwined with your well-being that it's foolish to try and separate them. But we trick ourselves into thinking that they are separate. Ubuntu champions the primacy of community and organization without neglecting the importance of the individual. Agi and I are living in the UK, and we appreciate for being there, but we also notice the major differences where individual rights almost stand outside the community organizational rights. I think there is a balance we can have. Individuals need community in order to be fully human. We don't become fully human because everybody has left us to be who we want to be and to do what we want to do. In Ubuntu, competition is not the lifeblood of society. That's what we have taught one another at school, and that's not true. Because every important thing that we do it as a matter of cooperation and interdependence, including baby making. We don't compete. We work with others in order to do what we want to do. The lifeblood of society isn't competition, but we have drummed that in our minds that it's almost like a mantra. It is the way things ought to be. Yes, there is some level of competition which awakens other people, but the biggest game we play when we are cooperating and are interdependent. In Ubuntu, we see that life and existence are interconnected. One, how do we notice that? For most people in Africa, the past, the present, and the future, they matter. I worry about my forefathers and mothers, and I do even worry about my mother who passed on, my father-in-law who passed on, what they think about me now. In my village, people laugh at you if you are just living as if life ends with you without bothering about those who will come long after you have gone. We know that those who have gone, our ancestors, have impact on us. Those yet to be born impose obligations on us. That's why when we are spoiling the environment, when our businesses are only producing what seems to work for now rather than for the future, we worry about that. Non-human beings matter. And again, that's why even in traditional society we referred to nature as Mother Nature, because we know how dependent we are on things we don't label as humans. So, Ubuntu philosophy, as you said earlier on, should help us to design an education system that promotes the values of interdependence, honesty, and utter respect for one another. Yeah, that must be part of what the core of education is. Once in a while, I go to teach at the Blekinge Institute of Technology in Sweden, and I arrived there and giving assignments to students who didn't look like they heard what I was saying. And then afterwards, I inquired, what's going on here? And said, you seem to be asking us to work on these things as individuals, that we don't work like that. I said, how do you work? I said, for instance, all of us in our master's degree program cannot submit a master's thesis if you wrote it alone. We write our master's degree in groups of minimum 3, but anything up to 6. And it dawned on me then that how come we train people to be prowess, to be super good, but as individuals, and yet when they graduate, they have to go and work with other human beings. They have to go and live with families. They have to go and in terms of training, everything is based on individual performance. It was the biggest lesson I ever got. These guys, by the time they are graduating, they worked for something that will determine their future, but in collaboration with other people. The skills they get, you and I who went into the traditional school can only imagine. Ubuntu should help us to create a healthcare system or healthcare systems that serve the well-being of all, not only those with wealth. We have accepted that it's normal for us in Zambia that when our ministers become sick, they will be flown to Morningside in South Africa. And when my mother in the village is unwell, it's how things are. How could we have lived with that? How could leaders themselves live with that? And we need to use Ubuntu to create economic systems that honor the economy's total reliance on Mother Nature. That economic systems are built on cooperation rather than simply competition. Economic systems that serve everyone, and no one is left behind. Thank you for the apology, but also thank you for the humanity to see how threatened those of us who are not from this country are by what is going on. Because you may have come on the scene as a younger nation in terms of independence, but you have the idea how much we look up to you for your leadership, for helping us to activate our capacity and human talent. By the same token, you can imagine how confusing, hurting it is to see what is going on. But we would be missing the point, because the majority of the people of this country are what you expressed. That we can sort of be misled and start thinking. But even with that, without justifying anything of what is going on, this country on the continent of Africa has much more potential and capacity to overcome whatever is the source of that than any other country on this continent. On this continent, I'm privileged to come here and work with some of the businesses that are found in Sandton. You know that you have more capacity to enable every kid go to school, to enable every person access quality health care. You need to rethink the redistribution of wealth. I have come here and I have worked with individuals who received a $1 million bonus at the end of one financial year. This is not Europe. This is not America. We are talking about South Africa. The wealth of this nation is extremely astounding. Forgive me if I'm overstepping my line, but it's just that those issues we are seeing can be dealt with. It's a form of crying that society is making. It's a form of crying. It's manifesting itself in an ugly way, but society is crying that we are better than this. We are more capable than that. In Ubuntu, winning together is possible. There doesn't have to be losers and winners. But we need the kind of leadership that is able to see through the veneer of what is going on now. The leadership that is capable of seeing what 20, 30 years in coming would look like and bring that in this moment. That is what presencing and theory U as our way of working is all about. How do we enable organizations, individual leaders, to develop the capacity and conditions in which we can see the future we want, but act in the present moment? Bebe and I worked for BP some years back, and I was surprised when I was invited to go as my beginning of coming to BP, and that was in Zambia. I was surprised when they invited me for interviews. And I went there, the managing director, head of HR, and the other senior guys who were there. After 15 minutes, the MD, Dan Moroka, picked a novel that he had put on the side and started reading the novel in my interview. And I could see the HR head elbowing him so that he could stop what he was doing. He just ignored her until she said, Dan, you got to stop that. You are interviewing somebody and you are reading a novel. And then he said, I don't trust him. He just sounds so clear about many things, but I've seen people like that who speak well and they don't know how to do the actual work. And I'm there doing the interview and I say, oh gosh, what do I do here? And then he said, by the way, I won't be involved in the final decision making. Later that afternoon, the HR head called me and said, you got the job. And when I went, Dan called me and said, Now we are stuck together. We have to make this thing work. And I started working with him. It was the most inspiring work relationship I ever had. 1 month down the line, because I was on a 6-month induction, and I was going to travel to London and Washington, D.C. for induction to see politics of oil. And a few days before I traveled, I went to Dan and I said, Dan, you know I'm leaving for London and Washington, D.C., and I'll come back only after 40 days. And then he said, and what happens to Bobo? And I said, I don't have Bobo in my team. He looked at me with disbelief. You don't even know your daughter's name? And I said, but how would you know? Why would you know my daughter's name? And then he said, look, who do you think I am? You are number 2 here, and I bring you here, and I don't know what matters to you. I know that your wife is studying in Ireland. You are the sole parent for now, for your 2-year-old daughter. I send you to London and Washington, D.C. for 40 days, and I expect you to perform at your highest level. Come on. He lifted the phone, called Sunny, who was our finance director, and said, is there anything in our system that would allow me to send Martin and his daughter to Washington, D.C. and London, and that while he is working, Bobo is either in the nursery or somewhere that she can be looked after with safety. Son found out, Bobo and I sat on the plane. It was like the entire aircraft was only for the 2 of us. We went to London, we went to Washington, D.C., we came back. What could Mr. Morocco ask me and I don't do? And throughout, he created relationships like that. When he came, BP Zambia was minus $5 million. 9 months down the line, we were $11 million, which meant in 9 months we had managed to generate $16 million. The magic was simply seeing humans across the system all the time. When we were doing town halls, who was there? Anybody from the cleaner through the telephone operator to the driver. We were in the town hall together talking about this thing called BP. So somehow, systems can shift at a faster pace if the leadership chooses to look in a certain direction. In organizations that we work for, bottom up is possible, but it's far much harder to find where it happens effectively because you are asking for a revolution. In societies, we have many cases of that. In institutions and businesses that we run, it is more around you, the individual leader, choosing the beliefs and values, and as a collective leadership team, that you subscribe to. And then from there, your organizational culture shifts. But you need to be clear. So what happens is that for most people, we are here. We want our organizations to move from here to there. No organization wants the other way around. And what we are constantly doing is that we are trying to fly past the chasm. But because we don't have wings, what do? We fall through the cracks. That's why 85% of change efforts in organizations end up in failure. What we found out in the Presencing Institute as we went listening to and observing leaders who had brought about transformational change is that they do what looks to be counterintuitive. They move through this line. It looks longer, but in the end it's shorter, neater, and cheaper. And it all begins with when we ask them, what is it that began the journey for you to bring about that? They tell us about 2 learning cycles. One cycle is simply this. We learn by reflecting on the experiences of the past. When we have acted, we stop to observe our actions. We reflect on what we have observed, and then we plan in order to act again. This is also known as the Cobb method of learning. It has served us phenomenally well. But what do you do and how do you learn in those instances when you do not have enough equivalents in the past to learn from? If you want to learn how the soon-to-be 9 billion human beings on planet Earth can coexist in harmony, no matter how hard you look in the past, you won't find good data of how 9 billion human beings can coexist. If you want to see how a parent behaves and supports children in an era where their phone can contain information and pictures that you, as a parent, would be horrified at looking at, no matter how hard you look in the past, you won't find good enough equivalents of how to do that. And that is what began to ask us questions. And we are learning from these change makers and innovators. Then they talked about another learning cycle. Learning from the future as it emerges. That human beings do this with natural ease. It's just that our education system doesn't support us to enhance that. Our education system is based more on A and not B. And I'm not saying they are exclusive. You can work with them because we intuitively work with them. That's why we see it in sports, in art. They intuitively tap into that. How do you think musicians bring tunes and sounds that have never existed? It's because they pay attention to something else. When we asked them, how does that work? They described this, that you have to be fully present to what is here and now, the beauty and the ugliness of what is there. But you don't get glued just to that. You stretch out, you sense that which is 5, 10 years in coming. And then you bring it into the present. And that is what constitutes innovation and creativity. It's the ability to confront the brutal realities of our time, but not limited to that. Then we stretch ourselves, what would 10, 15 years incoming look like? You remember that story when Steve Jobs was repudiated by his colleagues because he was sitting in one little corner every day. And the rest of the business was seeing him. So senior colleagues called him and said, Steve, this is nonsense. You can't be sitting there talking about a product for which there is no demand. Do you remember the response he gave? How can there be demand when they don't know what they will need in 5 to 10 years' time? He was claiming he was able to see what humanity will need in 5 to 10 years' time. And oh boy, wasn't he right. So, presencing is what allows us to observe. How does it work? You stop downloading patterns of the past so that you can see more. Innovators and inventors don't migrate to Mars, pick new ideas, and then come on Earth. They live with us in our streets, in our organizations. What allows them to see more out of the same reality, somehow they have learned in one way or the other to observe and see more out of the same environment. But when they have observed, they don't do that thing which you learned in the business school. They don't brainstorm. When they have observed, they retreat. Sorry, my slides are skipping. To go back slightly, how do we observe more here? If we go to the same phenomenon with the same mentality, we see same reality. To observe more out of the same reality, we need to switch on at least 3 intelligences. Most of us went to school saying we only think with our minds. Traditional wisdom shows that our heart is not just a blood-pumping machine. It is a faculty of thought. In many cultures, there is such thing as my heart told me. But we also now, through neuroscience and other human sciences, that the heart, through the vagus nerve, sends more messages to the brain than the other way around. So what we have changed through Cartesian thinking, traditional wisdom knew. And I know now, like last night when I couldn't sleep and everything else because I was worried about this morning, that it wasn't diarrhea. It was because I was feeling the message in my heart that something here is much more important than your sleep. So that's why I was sending messages at 5. So we humans, at the very least, think with 3 faculties. This, that, and here. But how do we switch on the intelligence of the open mind? It is by learning to suspend the voice of judgment. That little chatterbox that is in all of us, running a commentary. There they go, they come, there is again, and blah, blah, blah. We do that. That's normal. That's what the brain is designed to do. However, when we switch on curiosity, we create an antidote to judgment. Curiosity is when you genuinely want to access your ignorance. Tell me more. What happened? What is happening here? Where is this coming from? What else is possible with what we have? How do we switch on the intelligence of the open heart? It's by learning to suspend the voice of cynicism. Just because something is not clear to you, don't label it impossible, stupid, it doesn't work. And the antidote to voice of cynicism is compassion, the ability to connect with other. That's why when you speak about what is going on in this country, I hear you. But that's why we must hear even the ones who are involved on the street causing what they are doing. We have to connect with them. How do we switch on the intelligence of the open will? It is by learning courage. Fear is essential. We wouldn't grow to the age that we are if we didn't have fear. But if we are not able to suspend fear from time to time, we wouldn't experiment, we wouldn't prototype, therefore innovation wouldn't be there. So we observe, having suspended those voice of judgment, voice of cynicism, and voice of fear. Then we can see more. And when we have observed, we retreat to reflect so that we can allow inner knowing to emerge. We notice that these change makers create an artificial gap between observation and action. They enter a moment when they let what they have observed percolate. Now we have many tools that can help us to do that reflection. We can enter into many ways. When you reflect, somewhere here, you get some sparks of what is possible. The strongest sparks, prototype them, act in an instant. Your hands are sometimes wiser than your head will ever be. If you start here brainstorming on the ideas that are strongest, you can only produce reasons why it is stupid to try out. So they don't work like that. They work with strongest impulses and prototype them. And then that's what shapes the next phase.
Hi, good day. So just a thought on this. Going back to your 3 faculties of intellect, the previous slide. I think a big challenge that a lot of people don't realize, a lot of our society is stuck in the mind, let's call it the top one. And to migrate to actually opening up the heart. The society we live in today, if you look at all the stuff we see happening, it's one where the heart has been closed off. And this is one of the biggest challenges we face, to activate inner knowing. Because once your heart is closed off, and this happens throughout, because of various reasons, let's say how we grew up, we were taught in specific ways to think and act and believe. And I think with all respect, even the issue about what does my ancestors think of me, what does my parents think of me, those things place a certain belief systems on us that limits our movement in the direction of opening up that heart, opening up the mind and being in touch with your higher self, if you call it that. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges we face in this room, is how do we move away from that traditional way of thinking and think about how do we activate those faculties, whether it's inner, mental, intellect, because without being, and if you connect those 3 faculties, that's where this whole thing of being whole and being complete actually comes from. And a lot of us don't know that. So you focus on trying to do the right thing. But there's deep-seated belief systems in us that actually blocks those faculties from being unlocked. And getting through this, yes, I think my biggest fear of these kind of talks is that we look to leaders to do this. It's not them, it's actually us. Because each one of us has a responsibility to actually unlock those faculties within ourselves. Because when we do that, that's when we impact our society, our organizations, and most important, our families and communities. So that's just a thought on this topic.
Thank you.
Thanks. This is really, really insightful stuff. Biggest thing I see here are my two kids. I'm being parented by a 7-year-old, and I'm raising a I'm raising a 13-year-old. My 7-year-old is like this. He sees something on YouTube. He then goes onto his Switch and will hack Minecraft. No, he'll go and think about it, then he'll go hack Minecraft in an instant, and then I have to take his Switch in for repairs because he's buggered up the operating system. And it's difficult to deal with that with balance, but I'm extremely proud of how he is. My 13-year-old, so there's a bit of a gap there, was like that, and he's had it taken out of him by school, and maybe me. Right? It's easier to blame school. And that's my biggest fear. At some stage, Setu will stop behaving like this, and he'll behave in a linear fashion, and he'll be more suited to go work in somebody's factory to earn some multimillionaire more millions, and not live up to his promise. Have you seen any instances where this has been activated in a way that it's actually translated in the workplace or in the corporate space or in the societal space?
Yep. Thank you. Anyway, just a quick response. So yes, much of our work, Agi and myself and some of our colleagues, is to work with organizations and support them into how they activate this way of working. I was fortunate enough to have been invited by James, the CEO for the Rand Merchant Bank. And because they're asking questions, how can we be so successful in the midst of all that? And how come in the process of being so successful, we have so many people who are reporting challenges of mental health, suicide, and so on and so forth. So we do go through learning journeys with leaders from the bank so that they can do the experiments of how to evolve RMB to the new that they know is possible. But they are realizing it's tough because there is what is called corporate schizophrenia. The vision and intention point in this way. All the other things point that way. Governance, the level of patience, of capital, and everything else are pointing this way. Ownership is pointing that way. But at least they are aware and they are engaging and they are inquiring into that. So, yes. But also in other parts of the world, Agi and I are also running a global Africa classroom called Ubuntu Lab, which Egbe talked about. We realized with technology, we don't need the traditional classroom. We can actually engage with one another. And we have been shocked by the response, commitment, because we can sit in small groups using Zoom. You press a button, someone sitting in Cape Town and another person's in Cairo, and then Addis in Ethiopia, they engage in dialogue for 15 minutes. You press a button, they come back. 200 people in one go can learn together. That, for me, is the promise that the good side of technology brings. There is the shadow side, as you said, but there is so much we can tap into. I think I agree. Leadership cannot be just in the traditional sense of the position. It's any human being who feels if they collaborate with other people, they might just have the chance to shift the game from the way it is currently played. I had 5 minutes. I had a personal experience. Actually, it was again while working with Egbe in Cape Town. And after herself and I and others had gone through a leadership program for a long period of time, we were being prepared for the leadership of the business. But I found myself disappointed because most of the time I was thinking about my home country, Zambia. And on this morning I arrived, by then offices were in the city. I arrived, lifted my phone and called a friend back home. And I said, could you find me the number to the president's office? And then he said, Martin, what have you been smoking? But like all good friends are, after some time, he phones back, he gives me the number. And he said, please don't be silly with that number, which I now hear almost like the voice of fear. I worked as I would normally. 10 to 5, I looked at the number, some madness sipped in me, I dialed the number. Hello, State House, how can we help you? I said, my name is Martin Kalungu-Banda, can I speak to the president? Then the voice went, Mr. Kalungu-Banda, is the president expecting your call? I responded, no, but it's important that I speak to the president. Silence. Music. Then a new voice came. State House, how can we help you? I answered, my name is Martin, can I speak to the president? They asked me the same question, Mr. Kalungu-Banda, is the president expecting your call? I slightly emphasized my response. No, but it's crucial that I speak to the president. Again, silence, music, another voice. By then I had grown a little bit impatient, so I just said, I'm Martin, and I'm trying to speak to the president for the last few minutes. Then the voice went, Mr. Kalungu-Banda, this is the president, how can I help? At that point, then I forgot why I had called. To cut the long story short, I had a conversation with the president, and he invited me to travel to Lusaka, Zambia, to meet with him. BP was kind enough to permit me to travel, and I went. I chatted with the president. But to simply come to the end point of the story is that a year later, we had changed jobs, and Aggie and I had moved to Oxford. And the president called and said, oh, I'll be passing through London to go to New York. Can we meet? We met, and he said, I'm looking for a chief of staff. Can you be my chief of staff? And that's how, for the following 2 years, I had the privilege of serving my head of state as his chief of staff. When I went to work there, if anybody had allowed a call like that to reach the president, I would not just fire them, I would trace everybody who was on that line and fire them. Except now, I know slightly better than that. That somehow, when nature wants to use us, these little openings are allowed so that we can slot ourselves there. And then they close again. And this is not just a Martin story, it's the story of everyone. But we need to learn to stop when nature wants to uniquely use us in that way. And those moments are multiple. And maybe that's what makes leadership possible for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this breakfast and for the dialogue. Our intention, as I said at the start, was to stimulate thinking around how we can do this thing differently. And it might be different from any other breakfast that you've been to, in the sense that we didn't actually talk about creating a consistent employee experience across Africa. And that's the whole point of it, is that it's not the what, it's the how. And how we're going to do this is by opening our minds, by opening our will, and by opening our heart. And some of us intuit better than others, but all of us are able to do it. By feeling what can be, and then stepping into it. And not just me doing it, but Karen doing it, and Jen doing it, and Taryn doing it, and Gavin doing it, and Dee doing it, and Peter doing it, and Ursula doing it. And the more of us do it and do it consistently, we create that shift. Because the Obama Foundation says something, we are the leaders we've been waiting for. My passion for Africa is that we take these skills and that we deepen our thinking and that we change our doing, so that the Africa we want in 2063, which is tomorrow, we start creating today. Thank you for coming. Thank you. So we really have to run to Leader X now. But final thoughts, comments, things that you feel should be said because it's sitting and it needs to come out.
I just wanted to share the story of what one of the leaders we are working with in Ubuntu Lab, who's South African in Cape Town, did. There was a murder that happened, and she said she was shocked at how the family of the person who committed that murder came out in numbers to apologize. And they wanted to have a word with the widower, but that she was so shocked, how could she facilitate this conversation, because I can use it, the murder was by a black person murdering a white person. How does she do that? And then she remembered the Ubuntu journey that she had been on and thought, this is the time that I can do this. So she went over to the widower and said, this is what has happened, what do you think? And then the lady said, I don't know what I can do, but if they have come, and I know it has been hard for them to even come this way, I think let's embrace them. And that happened. So they were part of the funeral ceremony, and after that, this lady who has been part of the process said, why don't we start a conversation? Why don't we start hearing each other? Why are these things happening? And they have started having these women's circles. For the first time, they said they went into this township where they have never been. And things are happening. I don't know what it will be, but I just wanted to say after what you said, there are individuals in this country that are doing things. And it's up to you to start connecting with those individuals, because as a collective, you can bring about the change that you want to see. And thank you so much for the apology, but we are with you and we are there to support whatever initiatives you come across. And the Ubuntu lab is open and we'll be recruiting other people as well. If you have the time, please join us in the next cohort.
Thank you, Aggie. And there are many people who do this kind of work. Karen does it as well with the NNI Dialogue Institute. Dialogue Institute, yes. Talent Talks, it's part of what we do with the podcasting. It's part of what we do with clients, and what I hope to do in the consulting work I do is creating the space to have these conversations, creating the space where we can start getting leaders to think differently about what is possible. Thank you. Final, as we race off to Leader X. Yes, so thank you very much. God bless you. Thank you for being here and really being here. Look forward to seeing you at the next breakfast. Thank you.